Welcome to a celebration of Nantucket Sound, our monthly webinar series, and thank you to our organizer, Peter, for the fun oyster music. I'm Audra Parker. I'm the president and CEO of the Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound. We're based here in Hyannis on Cape Cod, and for those of you who aren't familiar with us, our organization is dedicated to the long-term preservation and protection of Nantucket Sound, the beautiful body of water that lies between Cape Cod and the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. The protection of Nantucket Sound is particularly important because it has a unique jurisdiction. And I think we're waiting for a map here. Yeah, if you can see from this map, it is split. Nantucket Sound is split between state waters that extend 3 miles from the shores of the Cape and Islands, with federal waters in the center of Nantucket Sound in the dark blue. So the state waters are protected under state law called the Massachusetts Ocean Sanctuaries Act and are part of a state ocean sanctuary system, but the federal waters in the center are not. So despite the fact that it's one ecosystem, it is under 2 different jurisdictions. So the Alliance has been working with a strong and diverse group of stakeholders to seek a designation for Nantucket Sound as a National Historic Landmark. And that's the highest level of historic protection possible. And we've got a broad coalition of support. We've got all the towns on Nantucket Sound on the Cape and Islands that support us, historic preservation groups, tribal entities, chambers of commerce, and on and on. So they're really representing tens of thousands of people that understand that Nantucket Sound is a place that's worthy of protection and that deserves recognition as a National Historic Landmark. And just to give you an example of other National Historic Landmarks in the area, you have the entire island of Nantucket is a National Historic Landmark, as is the Kennedy Compound in Hyannisport and Wesleyan Grove on the Vineyard. So with that short introduction, I'm very excited to welcome our speaker tonight. His name is Dan Martino, and he's from the Vineyard, and he's going to discuss oyster farming off the Cape and Islands, including in the waters of Nantucket Sound. He's going to touch on his book, The Oyster Book, a chronicle of the world's most fascinating shellfish, past, present, and future, as well as his upcoming second novel. Dan's the co-owner of Cottage City Oysters. He's farmed off Martha's Vineyard for over a decade and is the first in the state to grow commercial seaweed and the first in the nation to become organic certified for all his shellfish and seaweed products. I'm not done yet, Dan, because you have a very, very impressive background. The Cottage City Oyster Farm Tour, which Dan hosts, is recognized as one of the best oyster tours available and was the driving motivation for him to write his recent book. And finally, he has served on numerous local, state, and federal organizations to help steer the aquaculture industry into the future. So with that great introduction, I welcome you, Dan, and I'm very happy to have you here and to hear all about what you're going to say about oysters. I'm excited to learn more.
Very cool. Thanks for having me. Hopefully you can hear me all right and see me okay. And all right, perfect.
All of the above. And after you're done with your presentation, I will jump back on. And so if the audience has questions, you can just write them to me throughout. And at the end, I'll jump back on and I'll facilitate a question and answer session for whatever the audience wants to know. Okay, so with that, I will remove myself from the screen and you can start screen sharing and I will see you in a bit.
All right. I'm going to shamelessly promote my book here and
as you should
talk about oyster farming. And what's neat is when you show the map of Nantucket Sound, our farm is actually right on that invisible line between Vineyard Sound and Nantucket Sound.
Just like the invisible line between the state waters and the federal waters, I'm pretty sure the oysters and the fish don't recognize any of those boundaries.
For sure.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, I will exit and I'll see you in a bit. Thank you.
All right. Let me go ahead and share this screen here. And hopefully that's working for everybody. So here it is, the Oyster Book. Yay. Took 5 years for me to write a book. But what's neat about it is it all kind of came out of my interactions with people on our farm tours. So I'll kind of talk about how I got into oyster farming and how oyster farming has changed my life, and then these farm tours and getting to interact with people on our farm, and how that ended up kind of formulating into a book, and then we'll just kind of go from there. So let's start it out. So here's my farm. My brother and I started this in 2014. My brother Greg was a finance major from SMU. I was a TV producer. We both grew up in Texas. I got transferred to Martha's Vineyard for a TV job at Plum TV. If anybody remembers Plum TV, it was an amazing experience. And I invited my brother out on vacation, and he's kind of still on vacation. So the two of us now have families, and we live on Martha's Vineyard. I got into oyster farming, quick story, by filming a TV show. I ended up going out on my own and freelancing, and worked with, HGTV and Nat Geo and Discovery Channel and all these big TV networks. And as part of that career, I ended up being hired to film a show about the Billion Oyster Project in New York. And this was at a time when the Billion Oyster Project was just starting out. For those that don't know, the Billion Oyster Project, the entire goal behind this is to introduce 1 billion oysters to the Hudson River. Oysters filter 50 gallons of water a day. What they're eating is what you see in the picture here, the green color in the water. That's the phytoplankton, the algae. That's oyster food. So from a farmer's perspective, I want to see a lot of green because that means my oysters will be healthy and plump. From an environmental standpoint, if we have too much algae, it ends up looking like a golf course pond, right? The green scum on the surface of the water that has basically killed all of the wildlife inside of that pond or that body of water. And so that's what's been happening to New York for a very long time. Excess nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus running into the waterways, forming these giant algal blooms that then starve the body of water from oxygen, and the fish die and the seaweeds die. And by putting 1 billion oysters back into the water, they can consume all of that algae, stop the environmental harm, and basically allow the seaweeds and the ecosystem to recover. This is why oysters are keystone species. They basically have the ability, like a coral reef, to create ecosystems and habitats where none exist. So putting a bunch of oysters in an area is a really good thing. When it comes to farming, here we are, the first open ocean oyster farm in New England. So I filmed this Billion Oyster Project show. I took an oyster farm tour. I ate the oyster right off the farm at Island, and it blew my mind. I don't know if it was the first oyster that I ever ate, but it was definitely the most memorable oyster, eating it on the farm like I did. And came home and just wanted to be an oyster farmer. And so basically that day, switched careers, tried to get a permit, didn't go so smoothly. Making a TV show about farming oysters is not necessarily a good prerequisite for becoming an oyster farmer. So the reality was that my initial permit was denied, and for 2.5 years I needed to gain some local street credit in the oyster farming world. And I worked on a farm in Catama Bay, Edgartown, which is a massive oyster industry, and learned the Martha's Vineyard style of farming oysters. Reapplied, and 3 years later I was granted this site here in the open ocean. So open ocean sounds beautiful. Look at the water, it's pristine, right? This could be it is one of the cleanest and most pristine bodies of water. It'd be anything like in Nantucket Sound, if you could farm that, is by far some of the best water in the world, right? This area was formed by glaciers that sat here and melted and formed our islands. So it's just a very unique geography that can't be replicated anywhere else. And that's helping the two islands become basically like the Napa Valley of shellfish. Our bay scallops are world known. Our clams and oysters are now world known. So it's very awesome to be farming shellfish where we do. And I personally don't think the industry could ever get big enough to outgrow the demand for products coming from the islands. So I'm a huge advocate for more farms. What you're looking at in this picture, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the yellow box here is the boundary of the farm. It's a 4-acre site. And where we're tucked in here is right along the beach outside of Vineyard Haven Harbor. So even though, we're open ocean, we are still pretty tucked in. And that's due to weather, right? When you're in a salt pond farming oysters, you don't necessarily get hit head on by nor'easters or hurricanes, right? You have some shelter by land that hopefully, obviously these events are devastating, but for us, it's full on impact. This going back here, this image is looking straight across the water there to the Cape. So when nor'easters hit our farm, it's literally coming right through here. So it's been a lot. It's been a challenge. It takes 3 years to raise an oyster in this area. So we buy the seed when they're the size of like tomato seeds. They're very small. We buy those from a hatchery, and then we plant them on our site here. And 3 years later, we're able to bring a market oyster to market. So we have 4 acres. Our salinity is 34 ppt, which is it's very salty. It's open ocean. It's one of the saltier oysters that you can get. One of the remarkable things about oysters is that they take on the taste of their environment that they're grown in. So from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico on the east coast of America, every farm is growing the exact same animal. It's the exact same species of oyster. But when you plant them in different environments, they take on the embodiment of that body of water, and that's literally what you're eating. So when you're eating our oyster, it's this very clean, sweet, salty, little hint of metallic taste to a beautiful oyster. As this says here, we also grow sugar kelp. So I was actually reminiscing how we actually started growing seaweed before we were able to grow oysters. Back when my farm application was pending, we were approached by Woods Hole and the Martha's Vineyard Shellfish Group to do some research trials on sugar kelp. And so under the research permit of the Martha's Vineyard Shellfish Group, we actually planted a bunch of sugar kelp out here that first year. And it grew really well, and we harvested it, and then nobody knew what to do with it. And this was a long time ago, probably a decade now. And since then, we've just been growing sugar kelp, and we've been kind of at the forefront of the seaweed industry and have watched it grown. We helped work with regulators in the state to actually design the handling procedures for seaweed and the harvesting procedures for seaweed. The state didn't have these on the books at the time when we were doing all this. And then we were awarded the first commercial permit to grow and sell seaweed in the state. So that's pretty cool. And then recently, 2 years ago, we started growing bay scallops on the farm, which has been a huge challenge. They're dainty and intelligent compared to oysters. And they can see you coming, so you have to kind of be very gentle with them and not sneak up on them. But that's been a lot of fun, and we brought the first small batch of those to market last year, and now we're doing blue mussels out on the farm because believe it or not, this area, we get a wild set of blue mussels out here. They grow fantastic. So we're really hoping that we can, to go back one more time here, we're hoping we can make that entire coastline a mussel farm at some point. That's how much potential this industry has, right? It's still in its infancy. Every farm in the state is owned by an individual, a family member of the community. That's part of the regulations. You have to be a town resident to have one of these farms. And so that's just the way it is in Massachusetts, which is awesome. You'll notice the depth of our farm also, the 10 to 25 feet of water. This is how we kind of escape the tidal surges of hurricanes and nor'easters, right? So this is the infrastructure that we use. I don't own any of those waterfront homes. I wish I did, but until we do, we're going to be using this work raft. So this is literally just a plywood decking work raft. You'll notice the solar panels up top there provides us shade while we're culling the oysters and picking out the markets. Those solar panels actually power a small battery bank in that table there. That battery bank can run our power washer and then our sorter that you see there on the raft that we put the oysters into, and it helps grade them by size. What you see on the raft at the end there is our cages, and then here's a great shot of one underwater. So these cages sit on the bottom of the ocean. This is the Martha's Vineyard way of farming shellfish. In other places, Duxbury or Wellfleet, they typically farm on the tidal flats, right? So at low tide, the tide goes out. Their bags of oysters are kind of sitting there, and they can just walk out, pick them up, and harvest them. Because of the geography of the islands, we don't have those tidal flats. And so we end up being, whether you're in a salt pond or the open ocean, you tend to be in deep water that stays underwater, even at low tide. So we've designed these cages. We buy them from New Bedford, and they're awesome. And notice all the little fish around them. What becomes incredible is the amount of wildlife that ends up kind of congregating around these cages. They form, it's almost like an artificial shipwreck or an artificial coral reef, right? It's these incredible structures that are doing an incredible amount of filtering of the water and making it cleaner for us and providing us with food, but it's also providing habitats to a lot of other animals. It's important to point out that it's not easy to get an oyster farm. It's actually very, very difficult. The permitting is, it's ridiculous, to be honest. You have to go through about 12 different local, state, and federal agencies. So it's very, very hard. And then for each permit, each species that you want to grow on your farm, you have to get a different permit for that and permission for those species. And so it's not like a land farm where you get the farm and you can plant whatever seeds you want. It's very controlled of which animals you get to grow on your farm, whether that be seaweed or bay scallops or whatever it might be. Very controlled. So not easy. And one of the things you have to prove to get an oyster farm is that you're doing it in an area that commercial fishermen are not currently utilizing, right? So the state does not want to replace fishermen with farmers. They will only put farmers in areas that have no commercial fishing. And so the Division of Marine Fisheries, the state comes out when you want to get your oyster farm, you show them where it's at on, big application. And then they come out and they scuba dive your farm, and they do it in a big grid. They're looking for eelgrass habitat. They're looking for shipwrecks. They're looking for endangered species, Indian artifacts or known, Native American settlements. And then most importantly, they're making sure there's not bay scallops there or clams or anything of commercial value so that they don't disenfranchise one group for another group. So it's a very smart approach to make everybody happy. But it is hard to go through that process. But in the end, what you see here with the cage, we're bringing, again, there's lobsters in our traps now, eels, fish, conch, like everything. So it really is amazing. Once an area has been deemed an oyster farm, it can no longer be commercially fished, which is kind of a cool thing. They turn into almost nature sanctuaries, right? So, this yellow box is the oyster farm. Commercial fishermen are not allowed to drop pots within this area and catch the wild species that we have growing there. What they do is they line their pots all around the yellow box and catch any of them whenever they decide to leave our area. But that's awesome, and that's how it should be, right? So both fisheries are now benefiting. The farmers are benefiting, and the commercial fishermen are benefiting by having this farm here. And not to mention the shoreline is benefiting. When you put this gear there, it's actually buffering from storm surge, and it's buffering from tidal surge, and it's you know, a lot of these homes are rented, and now the renters come out to our farm and they get oysters, and they love it. So it's actually a huge win for everybody. So when we started this, there were no examples of oyster farms that we could point to. You know, there wasn't information like this out there demonstrating what a farm might look like or how it might operate. And so there was a lot of local pushback. You know, two brothers from Texas trying to get the first oyster farm in Oak Bluffs history. They thought it was going to be naturally like an oil rig looking contraption out there. Or the reality was they were worried property values would decline, right, by putting some kind of industrial practice in front of their houses. And so obviously none of that, you know, is a concern. But we had no way to prove that. And so one of the things we started doing was educating the community about oyster farming. Luckily, we have Eggertown, which is a huge industry. And so there's a lot of you know, known community members that farm oysters on the island. But you know, for summer residents or people who aren't familiar with Eggertown, they didn't know what it looked like. And so Greg and I had the good idea of let's take the oyster gear into the schools. Let's start teaching the kids about the benefits of oyster farming and how it works. And here's a cage, and here's oysters, and here's how it happens. And then those kids can go home to the parents that were, you know, against our farm, and they can tell their parents how stupid they are. And so that actually seemed to kind of work for us. You know, all joking aside, what it really did is it started an educational campaign within our farm business. So every year we're going to the different schools on the island, we're educating about aquaculture, and then we start getting calls from the classrooms wanting to bring the kids out to the farm. And so once the farm's up and running, now we're bringing the classrooms out on a boat, and we're actually showing them how oyster farming happens. And then before we know it, colleges are calling us, and they want to bring students out to the farm. They heard about an oyster farm that basically has an open door policy. And so that's what we became, is basically an open door for anybody that wants to learn about how this industry works. Come out to our farm and we'll show you how it all works. And then the students' parents are calling us, and they're like, hey, we want to come out to the farm. So before we knew it, my brother and I decided, well, there seems to be a lot of public demand for a farm tour, so let's open up and start doing farm tours. And you know, the attention has just kind of been there from the beginning. They sell out every year. We actually have to we restrict how many tours we do right now. We don't have a big staff. So we could run them every day in the summertime, probably without a problem. The demand is there, but we made the conscious decision not to be a tour company and instead to actually be oyster farmers. But it's amazing. I host the tours. I get to meet interesting people, and you know, what's amazing about our communities is that it's usually very intelligent people that are coming to our communities, right? And so you get asked on these tours, I get asked a lot of very good questions. And I feel the urge to have those answers for people, especially when they're paying for the experience and they want to know everything. And so that kind of started my journey of researching this industry. And it started by, just talking about our own farm, how it operates, And then somebody would ask, well, how old is oyster farming? So I would go home and look it up. So that way I'd have the answer for the next person. And so what you see here on the top left is Lake Fusaro. It's just west of Naples in Italy. And this was the very first oyster farm in human history. So this goes back to 100 BC. You had a gentleman named Sergius Orata who got the idea to start cultivating oysters in this pond so he could sell them to the Roman aristocrats. And believe it or not, many of the techniques that were invented back then are still in use today, especially in Europe. Pretty amazing. And so I start, learning that research. And then over on the top right here, we have some Wellfleet oysters being farmed on those tidal flats, which is the same way it's done in France. So I start learning about the different techniques around the world. And then basically COVID hit and our tours get shut down and kind of all tourism stopped for that 1 year, right? And, I had this hour-long spiel basically of information that I could kind of digest to people who were on the tour. And I think in an attempt to not forget it all, I was sitting at home contemplating what COVID was. I wrote it all down, right? So I start writing down, well, the history of oyster farming and how our farm works and how it works around the world. And the bottom picture here, 3D farming, which is what our farm basically kind of does now. We'll see the oyster cages on the bottom, the seaweeds growing on the surface. There's mussels dangling in the water. So this is the 3D farming that we're at right now. And it's just I'm accumulating basically all of this information, and at some point I start to realize, well, hey, this could actually, this is actually important because I'm not able to find, I'm reading all these oyster books and I want to know the answer to, a certain question, and that answer is not there. And so I go down the rabbit hole of, well, how does this aspect of the industry work in Japan? Or how does this aspect of the industry work in Europe? And then how does that compare to how we do it in America? And I start to realize that I am writing a book, and I've got 90 pages, and it is an actual book. I've got the actual book here. And it kind of just formulates into, I realize it's the past, the present, and the future is kind of what I'm writing about. The David McCullough type history, walkthrough of life on Earth and cyanobacteria being the first organism that appears on Earth, and then the oysters are one of the first organisms that evolved to eat that algae. And so you're going back hundreds of millions of years to the evolution of oysters. And I kind of walk up to modern times when humans meet the oysters, and that's millions of years ago, believe it or not. And I dive into the fossil records of Neanderthals and early humans that have been buried with oyster shells, and some of the theories on how the omega-3s in shellfish could have helped, form our bigger brains and brought about self-awareness. And there's some theories about, if you're an early human and your food source is out in the middle of the ocean and you have to rely on the low tide to be able to walk out there and gather it, then you're going to start timekeeping, right? And you're going to start paying attention to moon cycles, and you're going to start understanding there's a high tide and a low tide. And, every 12 hours, you're allowed to go back out into the ocean to harvest your food. And so there's a lot of theories that maybe that's how you start to form, some of these very old, ancient human relationships and ideas. So before I know it, I have a book. It's written. Whoa, what do I do now? And so I Googled, I'm going to go forward a couple here. I Googled, so this is the book. I Googled a couple independent food publishing books. And again, I think with my TV background, I had been creating stories for quite a while. I've edited TV shows and films, and so I use that same approach when writing this book. So So it was, by the time I pitched it to these publishers, it was very concise. It was very edited down, and I got multiple offers for the book, which was awesome. I really kind of came as a shock. My wife didn't believe it. She thought it was some, scam or whatever. Uh, but I ended up going with Agate Publishing out of Chicago. They had the best deal, and um, the CEO, he grew up on the East Coast and knew about the strength of oyster culture and shellfishing and how it can connect a community to their food source. And he really just understood kind of the thought behind the book. And so it got released in September of 2024. Um, I don't know what constitutes good book sales, but it seems to be selling pretty good for a book all about oysters. But what's great to me is that one of the important parts of the book when writing it was, yes, it's a fascinating story, the history and our relationship to this species and how every continent on Earth that's had access to the oyster, that population has made it a staple food for their diets. It really is one of these foods that kind of connects humanity. Um, so there's some beautiful ideas about that. But also, how are oyster babies made? And, how is farming done around the world? And how do you get an oyster farm? And what's the permitting process like? So that kind of constitutes the present section, the middle section of the book. And it was really written kind of almost as a textbook, it doesn't go deep into the details, but it's enough that you can understand what it takes and you could follow along to get a farm. And now, UMass Boston is using it as a textbook and required reading for the aquaculture students, which is awesome. And just the other day, I found out they're going to translate it into Russian. I didn't even, Russia's oyster industry is very small, but that's good. They're thinking ahead, and obviously they find some value in the book. And then the present section of the book, I'm sorry, the future section, the last section of the book really goes into climate change and resources and how our food, could be affected by climate change and basically the resiliency of this animal, the oyster, to probably be able to withstand, any of the worst future predictions that are out there. This animal has survived multiple extinctions. They survived dinosaurs and asteroids and climate change and everything that's been thrown at them. So I make the argument in the future section that we not only need to expand this industry and grow it as quickly as possible, and then I cite a lot of scientific research that backs that up, but that this animal should become a keystone staple of our diets again. And it was in the beginning of humanity. We basically ate them to extinction. So you get to learn all about that in the book. But the real take-home message is that with these bottom cages, especially, these are considered, cutting edge for the industry right now. The fact that we're in the open ocean, the fact that you could farm Nantucket Sound now, like that is an actual possibility. These cages are 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 foot, cubes. I think the future of the industry is seeing cages that are the size of SUVs, right? And it's large, fishing vessels that are now being used in farming. And you pick up one of these large cages, and it's just holding tens of thousands of oysters inside of it. And that's really how we return to the historical consumption numbers that we saw back prior to pre-industrial countries. So these bottom cages are now recognized as being really good in biodiversity recruitment. Shellfish is super sustainable. There's no fresh water, there's no land, and there's no feed, right? They're eating the green here. And this protein source is not competing with us for land or fresh water. Unlike cows or our land vegetables, which we have to designate land that humans could be using or fresh water that humans could be using. So seafood is way beyond more sustainable than anything on land. There's a 3-time economic multiplier for oyster farms. So for every dollar generated on an oyster farm, it's putting $3 into that local economy. And that's through taxes or fish houses middling it, or us buying fuel and ice and boat services, or the restaurants, quadrupling the price of the product when it's sold to you. And it's resilient against climate change. So we're here to stay. Oyster farming is definitely in its infancy. And then this is kind of the last, I love this. So here we are, right? Anything in the light blue, hopefully you can see the color gradient there, is beneath, I think, 25 feet of water. That's currently farmable with current technology in oyster farming right now. If we were to do those giant SUV-sized cages that would weigh tons, they would most likely never move in a major hurricane or a nor'easter. If our little cages can withstand it, I'm pretty sure an SUV-sized cage would be able to do it. And if you get them down deep enough, that tidal surge rolls over the surface of them and doesn't budge them. So basically anything in the light blue here, we could be technically farming right now. What's holding us back? Well, it's just a bunch of mom and pop people like me farming oysters right now, and I don't have the investment to basically go out there, or the desire or need at the moment to go out in the middle of the ocean to farm these things when I can do it a little bit closer to land. But I hope this kind of at least shows, just how small this industry is right now and how big it could be, and how and that we sit, our islands sit in this beautiful triangle of Boston and New York. And that we could basically be supplying oysters to these 2 major cities with unlimited, demand. We could never meet the demand of these cities. So I'm just a huge advocate for it. I hope you guys have some questions. Would love to answer some questions. And I guess I'll turn it back over here. That sounds good.
Hey, Dan, that was great.
All right.
Thank you. I learned a
One more.
lot.
Can I shamelessly, you can buy it at Amazon, get it on your local bookstores. The local bookstores need your support. And I do signed copies on the cottagecityoysters.com website also. They get mailed right to your house. But hopefully somebody will buy the book here.
I'm sure somebody will. I already had somebody reach out that says, this is George, and he says, he had a conflict, so he couldn't join, but he sent me a question. My question is, how hard would it be to start and maintain a small oyster farm, kind of like a vegetable garden? And then he says, I would love a copy of the book. So we're gonna get one for George. But
You're right, George. That's an awesome question. So in the Chesapeake Bay, if you have a dock, you're allowed to hang oysters off your dock and grow them and have your own personal stash, like your little garden of oysters, right? And it's an incredible program. Right now in Massachusetts, at least all the municipalities on the island here will not allow that to happen. So it is a town by town basis. Basically, you need to get your Shellfish constable and your Concom on board to basically help you move that forward. And we are starting to have those discussions because, who doesn't want their own personal supply of oysters hanging on the dock? The worries are that, oysters, obviously, if they're mishandled, can get people sick, right? So the best way to get yourself sick on an oyster is to harvest it and leave it in the sun for hours before you decide to eat it, right? Because the way that the Board of Health views oysters is that they're little petri dishes. So when you harvest an oyster, whatever bacteria that was naturally in the water is now trapped in that oyster. When it warms up to a high enough temperature, the bacteria is multiplying, and then you eat it, and it's reached a level that's beyond what your immune system can handle. So that's why people get sick. As a farmer, right, I have an hour to 2 hours. When I pull that oyster out of the water, it has to be under ice and below 45 degrees, right? It has to get cold very quickly. What this does is it inhibits any bacterial growth that might occur inside of that oyster. And then the oyster has to stay refrigerated until it's sold to you at the restaurant. So this is how it's guaranteed to basically not make you sick, is that that oyster is kept very cold. There's a lot of checks and balances to make sure that happens. And it's the second most regulated food behind raw milk. So there's a lot there. And as a farmer, with all the skin in the game, I don't want anybody to ever get sick on my oyster. Like that's the worst thing that could ever possibly happen. So I do everything I can to ensure that that product stays safe. The worry of the towns is that somebody could come steal your oysters, or they might be on a low tide and your bag's been hanging there for the entirety of the low tide out of the water, and then you decide to eat them and get sick. Or the fear would be that you import, some species of oyster that has diseases, and then it wipes out the native population of oysters that are around. But the Chesapeake Bay has the perfect model. They've figured it out. Their towns have that model and how to make it work. It's just a matter of the people bringing that to our governments and getting them to approve it.
And I know that short of commercial fishing, at least here in the Cape, you can get recreational shellfishing permits. I go out oystering, and I'm curious about the difference in the regulations between commercial and recreational. For example, when I go out, there's usually a natural resource officer, and they check your catch. You're limited to how much you can have, and the oysters have to be at least 3 inches, versus I've gone to restaurants and now they seem to be marketing petites,
Yep.
which are less than 3 inches. So I know that's one of the differences.
For sure. And those recreational permits are the best bang for your buck when it comes to harvesting. There's nothing more fun. I've got my wife and kids addicted now. They're little, where you go out and you go clamming, or you go dip netting for bay scallops, or you collect oysters. We're really privileged to have access to these things. There really is no need to hang oysters off your dock, right? Because you can get one of these permits and go out and get them.
Yeah, here you can get about a peck. So I think I can get, 100 oysters a week, and that's a good amount of oysters to eat.
Oh yeah,
every week.
oh yeah. And so what the Vineyard has done is for the oyster recreational and industry, is we don't allow the harvest of oysters in the summertime. And that's what our towns have done. They've said, you can harvest them anytime the weather's basically cold, right? To ensure that the product stays safe for people that aren't educated on how to handle it. But everything else is open for harvesting in the summer. So if you're a year-round resident, it really makes no difference, when you get your recreational permit.
Okay, so I have a bunch of questions from people, so we'll blow through these. Brian says, a common perception with lobsters seems to be too big, too chewy, and less tasty than the 1¼ pounders. Are bigger oysters less desirable?
Ooh, yeah, it depends. So we do a lot of catering and raw bars and the tours. I get to hear a lot of feedback. Big oysters can be considered gaggers. We hear that a lot. Like, oh, that's a gagger. I'm gonna gag on that oyster. And so the petite oysters tend to be good entry level products. But it also comes down to the farm. Like we can grow very large oysters. It takes a lot of time to grow them. But we've decided, and we've kind of stumbled upon our perfect size, which is a 3-inch to 3.5-inch oyster. That just seems to be when the oysters, at its most perfect kind of size, shape, depth, bite, flavor explosion in your mouth, right? The Chinese market, for instance, they'll only eat giant oysters. They want the 4-inch, 5-inch, 6-inch oysters. They look at a 3-inch oyster and it's not ready yet, right? So it really, I try to just compare it most to wine. It's very much like wine. You might like red wine, or you might like white wine, right? You might like Sauvignon Blanc, or you might like Pinot Grigio when it comes to white wine. So it's the same with oysters. You might like this one a little bit better, than that one, or you might like this size a little bit more than that one. And that really comes down to personal preference.
Okay, thank you. Ruth is asking, how do the commercial fishers know where your farm begins and ends?
Awesome question. Yeah, so anytime you see yellow buoys on the water, that is the Coast Guard markers for a farm of some kind. So you'll see giant yellow buoys out there, and they should have the license, the number of the farm on that buoy. Um, in my town, in the state of Massachusetts, the ocean is public water. You're allowed to swim in that farm. You can sail in that farm. You can recreationally fish in that farm. So you're going to lose your fishing gear. Like I haven't bought lures in a very long time because they all got hung up on the cages that are sitting on the bottom of the ocean. So it's kind of like being there at your own risk. But you know, it should be marked very well. Like I have four corner buoys that are yellow, and then I have four buoys in between those four buoys that are yellow. So it's a pretty easily identifiable area.
Okay, great. Alan says, oysters are raised in cages, but what about scallops? How are they contained, and do you plant eelgrass?
Yeah, good question. No, we don't plant eelgrass. We're trying. The Martha's Vineyard Shellfish group is actually on the cutting edge now of kind of breeding eelgrass and trying to figure out how it breeds, how it can, how we can plant it and get it to survive. It's very hard. But they're trying it and they're having success at it. We put the scallops in the same gear that we do with the oysters. Um, very less densities. You have to give them a lot of space or they'll kill each other. Um, and then we also hang them in these Chinese lantern nets. They're like cylinder nets that hang in the water column, and they have these tiers that we put them in. And so we're just trying. I mean, that's where we're at right now. We're trying different gear types, different methods. Everything works to some extent, right? It's just we're finding it's a lot more labor involved. Um, I think in the ideal situation, you would have an eelgrass meadow with a fence around it, and you would have a bunch of wild scallops in there free ranging underwater, and then you could kind of harvest them. But you're also not allowed to have an oyster farm where an eelgrass bed is. That's part of the rules. You're not allowed to disturb that habitat. So the gear is what you have to use, and we're just trying to figure it out.
Okay. Sandy's asking, have you tested the water quality in your oysters for toxins and debris resulting from the turbine blade failures that happened last year's?
Yeah, not specifically to the wind farm, but we do have water probes out there, and so we're constantly testing the waters for their quality. It's important to note that an oyster is filtering 50 gallons of water a day. It's doing this on the micron level, so it's stuff you can't even see with your eye. The only thing the oyster is ingesting is algae. It knows the difference between phytoplankton and fiberglass. And so or sand, anything really. The only reason sand gets in there is because it might be blowing in from a storm. But for the most part, when they're filtering, they're only ingesting the algae. If they do get sand in them, or let's say somehow a wind turbine blade did get inside of an oyster, it would spit it out. That's just what they do. And then pearls are made by that little grain of sand that ends up getting stuck in the back of the oyster's throat, and it can't spit it out. And that's a 1 in a billion rarity, which is why they're so rare to find. But yeah, I mean, what you're basically eating in an oyster is just phytoplankton.
So this is a related question. Kate is asking, if oysters eat blue-green algae, are they safe to eat?
Yeah, and in fact, in France, they have these little tidal pools that they purposefully grow blue-green algae in, and then when they're ready to harvest their oysters, they put the oysters in there for a couple weeks so that they become this beautiful blue-green color. And then when you eat them, you're eating a blue-green oyster. And so, yeah, it does not build up to the levels that make us sick, But also, it's important to note that the state and the towns are very active in monitoring the water quality of farms, and they will not put farms in areas that are contaminated or have, pollution of any kind. If there is a cyanobacteria outbreak in the pond where the farm is, they shut them down immediately. If even if the steamship discharges poop near my farm, it's going to get shut down immediately, right? So it's a very regulated industry.
Okay. Ruth is asking, what's the interest of Russia in oyster farming?
I think Russia sees. My next book is on. So the number one question that I'm asked on these tours is, how will climate change affect your oysters? Great question, right? And so now I've started deep diving into, well, how is climate change going to affect all of our food in general? So that's what the next book's about. Where we're heading into the future is probably an Arctic Sea that has no ice, which is probably the climate of Martha's Vineyard at some point, right? So I think Russia's looking that far ahead. I think our government's looking that far ahead, right? Where all of a sudden you're able to grow oysters as far north as the Arctic Sea. But Russia does have a small industry already that hasn't really been able to take off, and so I haven't. Maybe they're hoping to learn something. I don't know.
Henry wants to know, how might the growth of SUV-sized cages impact the economics of oysters and oyster farming?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. To me, it depends on the oyster, right? My oyster would never be used for something like fish food or chicken food because the water quality is too good, and Vineyard and Nantucket oysters are highly sought after for human consumption. So these have the highest margins possible. So it would be silly to sell those as like commodity prices for animal feed. But in the larger thinking of it all, shellfish is the best thing that we could be feeding to fish farms or chicken farms or turkey farms. It's a sustainable source of protein and nutrients. It's way better than corn. It's way better than soy. And so the thinking is that, right, eventually these SUV-sized oyster cages, these are maybe less desirable oysters on the human consumption scale, right? They wouldn't be super sought after, but they could go to other markets. And we're starting to see now a ton of other markets for oysters.
Okay, Anonymous says, great topic and presentation, thank you. Is there really only one type of oyster? If so, why is that the case? If there are other species, why are they not also grown?
So, right. So we eat about a dozen oysters in America. There's about 12, or I'm sorry, in the world. There's about 12 different species of oysters in the world that are farmed and eaten for human consumption. Way back in the day, the governments that be decided that Crustacea virginica, which is the native oyster to the east coast of America, it's only found on the east coast of America naturally, should be the only oyster allowed to be grown here. There were attempts to bring Chinese varieties of oysters or Pacific oysters or the European flat Ballon oysters. And then there was fear that these different species might, overtake the environment and eliminate our native population. And so every state on the eastern seaboard has decided to make it illegal to farm other species of oysters. If you go out to Seattle or the west coast of America, you can find multiple varieties, 6 to 7 different varieties of oysters growing sometimes on the same farm. And that's just because the West Coast was founded in the gold rush days and the stake your claim, and everything was a little bit different back then.
I lived in Seattle many, many years ago, and we used to go out and get Olympia oysters, which
Oh,
were
yeah.
considered a delicacy out there.
Which are for people who know, they're like the size of a
Tiny.
quarter,
They're tiny. Yep.
but they pack one of the most flavorful.
Yep.
I mean, they're amazing. Yeah.
Really good. Okay, Margaret wants to know, how long can you keep oysters frozen?
Ooh, so I keep mine in my refrigerator for about 2 weeks. I keep them just on a plate. I don't put them in the freezer. If you put them in the freezer, they're gonna die. I don't know how long you can keep them in the freezer. Probably for a very long time. But I keep them in my refrigerator for about 2 weeks. If they open up, they've died and you shouldn't eat them. You could cook them, but you definitely don't want to eat them raw.
Do you keep
Uh,
them uncovered or do you put like a damp cloth or anything?
some people do the damp cloth. I just
Okay.
keep them uncovered.
Okay.
They'll stay 2 weeks out of the water in a refrigerator, and they're as good as the day you pulled them out. It's pretty awesome.
It is. Okay, Al says your oysters are underwater 24/7, but Wellfleet oysters are tidal and out of the water during low tide. Does that affect the oyster?
Yeah, definitely. Awesome observation. So we have to mimic that low tide with our raft, and we air dry the oysters every couple months. We pull every cage out of the water. We harvest it. The oysters that are not yet ready to go to the market will sit on our raft for 24 hours. We're simulating a low tide, right? We're allowing the sun and the waves to basically kill the barnacles or the seaweed or the things the biofouling that's attached to the oyster that's trying to kill it. Um, and then this in turn strengthens the abductor muscle in the oyster because now it's holding itself shut for 24 hours out of the water, which builds that muscle up over time, which creates a sweeter taste. So Wellfleet oysters tend to be a little bit sweeter than our oysters, just because, or tidal oysters in general tend to be a little bit sweeter than their subtidal counterparts. And then after the 24-hour air dry, we go out the next day. We drop that cage back into the water. The oysters come back. Everything else has kind of died, and the oysters start dancing again and filtering. And then we won't harvest that cage again for another month or two.
Okay. Anonymous attendee just making a statement. Old timers always said only harvest oysters in a month with the letter R in it.
Yeah, I've got that in the book. Should I?
Okay.
Yeah, check out
Um,
the book. But there's a couple. I go into there's two different thoughts on that that I kind of detailed in the book. The main one is that they typically spawn in the months without an R. Your May, June, July, August. So you wanted to make sure the population would be around. And then there's other thoughts that it goes back to Rome, and they had these old timey rules in Rome, which also the R, they didn't have the months. I went and checked the Roman months and how they spelled it. They didn't have R's in their months either. So, there's some truth to that too.
So apparently you're getting some book sales and some merchandise sales off this webinar as well, Dan. So James says, ordering some stuff on your website. I love the shucking knife and t-shirt. Great prices too.
Cool, man.
Kathleen says, thank you for this fantastic webinar and interesting and informative presentation. I'm hosting a reception late April in Woods Hole called Championing Coastal Resilience and the Blue Economy with William and Mary Society of 1918. We're planning a larger forum in the fall on the Cape. I will recommend the book and oyster farm tours. I may contact you after this webinar about such. Thank you.
Yeah, please. And that's awesome you're doing that. I hope that's my take home message here is that like the blue economy is what we need to be investing in. It's the smartest thing we could build right now for, the future of our food and humanity and our economics and just everything. So that's awesome. Yeah, the more of that, the better.
So we should be getting you to donate a portion of your book sales to the Alliance to Protect Nantucket
I'll
Sound.
donate some tours to help raise some money.
Okay, we could talk about that
I haven't even
offline.
gotten a check from books, so I don't even.
Okay,
The
all right, in the
tours are more
future.
valuable at this point.
All right, just a couple more questions, and we're coming up on 7. Tom says, you mentioned that scallops can kill each other. How does that happen?
Yeah, if you overcrowd them, I'm going to pretend my hands are scallops. They'll actually fight each other and scissor each other to death to make room for themselves. So it's kind of like the alpha scallop in the bag will go around and kill the smaller, weaker ones so that it can kind of like spread its elbows out and have some growing space. So we learned that the hard way, and you'll find them like scissored into each other, or they'll hide in each other. They'll kill one and then back itself into its shell, so it has like 2 shells for protection.
Overtaking its house.
It's wild.
Okay, so that's what I have for questions. I have two questions, personal ones. One, how many oysters can you shuck in a minute?
Ooh, I have no idea. A lot.
A
Probably,
lot?
yeah, a
I'm
lot.
still struggling with that. Maybe we can have you back to give a oyster shucking
Yeah,
demonstration.
everybody should know how to shuck oysters for sure.
Yeah. Okay. And then my last question is, what's your favorite oyster recipe, short of just eating them just shucked?
Man, I love them raw, but in our house we do oyster Rockefeller like a couple. We try to do it a couple nights a week, but it's definitely one night a week. Because I have little kids, 9, 7, and 3, and even my 3-year-old will eat oyster Rockefeller.
You can't beat oysters Rockefeller. Yeah.
No, they're so good, and then you can get the really big ones too, and you just load them with all your toppings, and yeah, it's awesome.
I'm glad you enjoy your oysters, both getting them and eating them. So anyway, so Dan, thank you again. And I know your website is what, cottagecityoysters.com.
You got
And
it.
if people have questions for Dan, you can contact me. I can,
No,
contact
just
him.
email me. Yeah,
Perfect.
email, yeah, Cottage City Oysters, info@cottagecityoysters.com, and I'll write you back as quick as.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you, Dan, for
Thank
that.
you.
That was really wonderful. And thank you to our audience for attending. We've got a couple webinars coming up over the next few months let me just see, in April. If you can go to the next one, we are doing tackling climate challenges on the Cape and Nantucket Sound with Emmy Award-winning meteorologist Christopher Gloninger. Hope I said that right. And on Thursday, June 12th, songbird banding on Nantucket and the Sound with Libby Buck from the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. So I hope you can join us at future webinars. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us. You can reach me at audra@saveoursound.org. And again, I hope everyone enjoyed that and hope to see you next month. All right, have a good night.